Thank you for joining us today to learn from and think with Kandice Chuh about uncommon sensibilities and aesthetic education. I'm very happy to be hosting this talk on Kandice's wonderful book, The Difference Aesthetics Makes on the Humanities After Man, which was originally planned as an in-person event a year ago. When it was announced that the book had received the 2021 Book Award in Humanities and Cultural Studies, Media, Performance, and Visual Studies / Multidisciplinary Approaches from the Association of Asian American Studies, I saw it as an affirmative sign or prod from the universe to reschedule this talk. Some of you may have also attended the book talk with Thuy Linh Tu, Kandice, and myself on Friday via Intellectual Publics. In case anyone is annoyed or worried that Kandice Chuh and I are stuck in some narcissistic and codependent time loop, like characters in Ruth Ozeki book, I want to assure you that we are not, and that in a parallel universe, these two events happened 1 year apart from each other. That so many of you are here from afar is a testament to the wide-ranging impact of Kandice's scholarship, but also her commitment to and extraordinary capabilities in genuinely collegial, yet also intellectually honest and critically astute world-making against the many impossibilities of the university and our actually world more broadly. We can also see this in the many enthusiastic co-sponsoring units at UC Irvine for this event today. In addition to the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies, I would like to acknowledge the support of the Department of Asian American Studies, the Department of English, the Center for Critical Korean Studies, and the Office of the Dean of the School of Humanities. We know that these events are never possible without the steady support of hardworking staff members. So thank you to Jennifer Choi, who helped produce the flyer and manage the publicity and the RSVP list, and to Joo-Hun Sin of the Center for Critical Korean Studies for providing the technical support today. I hope that we can actually have a real conversation in response to Kandice's presentation. So I want to encourage everyone to please let me know via the Q&A function if you would like to pose a question on camera, which would be ideal, or I can also read your question out loud if you place them in the chat, and then I can also start to create a queue. Kandice Chuh is a professor of English, American Studies, and Critical Social Psychology at CUNY Graduate Center, where she is also a member of the MA in Liberal Studies faculty and affiliated faculty of the Africana Studies program. She is currently executive officer of the PhD program in English, and in the past served as coordinator of the American Studies certificate program and acting associate director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. In addition to The Difference Aesthetics Makes, she is the author of Imagine Otherwise on Asian Americanist Critique, published by Duke University Press in 2003, which won the American Studies Association's Laura Romero Book Award. Chuh is also co-editor with the wonderful, fabulous Karen Shimakawa of the collection Orientations, Mapping Studies in the Asian Diaspora, published in 2001. She has also published in such venues as Public Culture, American Literary History, Social Text, and the Journal of Asian American Studies. President of the American Studies Association from 2017 to 2018, Chuh is a member of the Association of Asian American Studies and the Modern Language Association. She is at work on a collection of essays titled The Disinterested Teacher, and her current research focuses on Asian racialization in the era of globalization. Chuh teaches courses on aesthetic theory, queer of color critique, women of color feminisms, decolonial studies, and Asian American racialization. I had asked the wonderful Julia Lee, the chair of the Department of Asian American Studies at UC Irvine, to prepare some comments about the difference aesthetics makes. Unfortunately, Julia is not able to be present today due to family illness, but she has graciously prepared some written remarks, which I think will serve as a generative, illuminating introduction, or what I might call a new genre of scholarly engagement, a response that prods us to listen, pay attention, and warmly lights up the space for one another. So I'm going to be reading Julia's comments. My desire to say a few words about the impact of Kandice's ideas at this difficult moment has nothing to do with a sense of duty toward any institution or department, or a desire to maintain a reputation for professionalism. Rather, I write these remarks in the face of loss in an attempt to honor what the difference aesthetics makes proposes, namely that we, as hopeful participants of the illiberal humanities, direct ourselves toward, quote, the protection and flourishing of people and of ways of being and knowing. That's a quote from page 2 of Kandice's book. The very qualities that Kandice asks us to connect to the humanities are the qualities that she has always modeled for and extended toward me, and I'm sure others in her orbit. For that, I thank her. What does a humanities that protects and flourishes peoples and ways of being and knowing look like? We know that traditional narratives of liberal humanism make natural a notion of personhood that has been the rationale for projects of empire, capital, and racism. We know that there have been and continue to be various attempts to critique liberal humanism from both within the university and without. The difference aesthetics makes advances that critique by attempting to unravel the human from liberal humanism. It asks us to consider what the humanities would look like if we seriously rethought the, quote, human that seems to reside so innocently in the heart of liberal humanism. What if, instead of offering full-throated defenses of the humanities based on its supposed ability to make all of us, especially our students, better workers and global citizens, we took a step back and rethought the term in all of its possibilities? The book presents us with a potential version of an answer in its exploration of what Chuh calls, quote, illiberal humanism, a humanities that is constantly working to disengage itself from a long history of bodily and political violence, and that is based, quote, in Chuh's words, in the historically grounded, embodied knowledges subordinated within the liberal regime, unquote. Chuh asks us to route this rethinking through the practice of aesthetic inquiry, which, like it or not, is a, quote, persistent presence in the intellectual traditions that ground the epistemologies organizing our received knowledge, unquote. The difference that aesthetics make, then, is that it provides a frame through which we can make sense of our experiences. Aesthetics relies upon a sensus communis, or sensibilities held in common, in order to define its standards and make its judgments, just as politics requires the aesthetic in order to define who belongs in the community and who can speak in and for it. Sense is important for Chuh because in her telling, it encompasses more than the Kantian notion of common sense, that is the, quote, necessary condition for specific aesthetic judgment, unquote. It also includes that which is experienced bodily. Chuh reminds us that it is often from the visual that racial capital draws its power to, quote, secure racist common sense, unquote. And her analysis throughout the book frequently looks to other types of sensorial encounters to make the case for an aesthetics that acknowledges its politics. The critical act that Chuh models is one that imagines race outside of the regime of the visual. It is an act of imagining otherwise. My invocation of Chuh's first book at this juncture is no coincidence. Just as the difference aesthetics makes asks us to imagine a humanism that is not yoked to liberalism. Imagine otherwise asks its readers to imagine an Asian American studies that is not beholden to an Asian American subject. Chuh's charge to the field has been widely cited, but also misconstrued, as her postscript suggests. The difference aesthetics makes shows us that, quote, the proper subject of Asian American inquiry isn't just the Asian American subject. It is humanism in all of its versions. The proper subject of Asian American inquiry is knowledge production, representation, and aesthetic education. It is an inquiry based on a skepticism that all we can be or feel is defined by what we see or how we are seen. Therein lies the power of Chuh's work for a specifically Asian American studies context. It embraces an idea of the field that is expansive but non-invasive, qualities that are misidentified as being negation, unquote. And so that is the end of Julia's wonderful comments and pre-response to Kandice's presentation. And let's light the way for Kandice. Thank you.
That's really beautiful. Thank you so much, Laura. My first and biggest thanks are to Laura and the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies for arranging this talk, for sure. There is a lot of work involved in making these kinds of events happen. So, Jennifer Choi, Juvun Sin, thank you very much for your efforts also. But my thanks to Laura also extend to the ways that she models and practices a form of collegiality that is precisely defined by a willingness to get into the muck and carry always more than her fair share of the work necessary to hold up the world for others. I'm grateful as well to her for her big brain. I regularly define her in that way, from which I learn so much all the time. She has long been an interlocutor for me, which means in part that what I think and write, including in this book, very much reflects those insights. I want to thank as well the co-sponsoring units, the Department of Asian American Studies, English, the Center for Critical Korean Studies, the Dean of Humanities Office, and to all of you who are here. And particular gratitude to Julia for such a generous reading of the work and for her own act of collegiality in providing them despite difficult circumstances. As we get going and throughout this event, we could hold her close to heart, I think, as we move forward today. I'm grateful for this opportunity to gather with you all, to share and think collectively about the ideas regarding some of the work we do under and within the rubric of the humanities in the US University. I'd like to ask as we commence that we pause and with deliberation make ourselves aware of the people and the long and complex histories that have unfolded to bring us together in this way, in this present, and to remember the people and communities that make each of us possible in this space. I mean in this pause to remember the ongoing dispossession and sovereignty struggles of Indigenous peoples. Where I am in northern New Jersey, the historic and ongoing struggles of the Lenni Lenape against settler colonialism and for sovereignty that is the condition of possibility for immigration to the US. I want also to remember those who created space for us in the academy, who have taught us, whether in and through formal academic institutions or not, and those who study with us, whether formally students or not. Each of us is comprised of and made possible by, and thus are accountable to multitudes known and unknown to us and widely distributed across time and space. At the core of how I envision and try to enact pedagogies, that I believe can help us find our collective footing in the current conjuncture is this deliberate practice of remembering as much, of, that is, creating and holding space for this crowded and demanding and sometimes fraught thickness of the present, to be brought to bear on the conception and practice of intellectual life as it takes place and unfolds in and through the academy. The active question for me is consideration of what happens to the structures and arrangements of the university if we take as horizon the work of opening portals that allow us to sense and make sense of and with the historical underpinnings out of which the present emerges, that allow us to hold open space for those devastated, excluded, and or marginalized in the course of the present's emergence, that enjoin us to remember and mourn and celebrate and try to honor those who have come before and those who will come after, as well as those who are contemporaries. These are some of the propositions I offer for our collective consideration this afternoon, and I'll return to them again in what follows. What I'm sharing with you today brings forward ideas generated in the course of thinking about the prospects and potential of the humanities and the US University as sites for radical thought, a critical path that has taken shape as the book The Difference Aesthetics Makes, and what I'm working on now, which is a collection of essays titled The Disinterested Teacher, that thematizes teaching broadly construed, as well as a project that focuses on contemporary Asian racialization. My research interests have been and remain tethered to my seemingly infinite preoccupation with trying to understand what and how we study and why and with what effects. I can't seem to escape the heuristic as object of knowledge. This is undoubtedly in part the result of having been immersed in graduate school in cultural studies methodologies, which means I was trained to ask some version of what are the conditions that give rise to certain ideas, formations, understandings, situations, affects, beliefs, experiences, and in what ways are those ideas, formations, and so on legitimated and disavowed, celebrated and subordinated. This attachment to the heuristic is also a result of having been asked countless numbers of times, both in and beyond graduate school, what is Asian American literature, the institutional construct with which I'd come to identify myself. My first book was an attempt to come up with an answer to that prompt and concerned itself with the term Asian American. This recent book turns out in a sense to be about that latter term, the literature. What is it that I do as an English professor? What claims and assumptions and conditions accompany such a position and such work? And how do they align and not with the aims of minoritarian discourses like Asian Americanist critique? I've come to understand and to translate such questions in the idiom of aesthetic inquiry. Moreover, doing so has provided a way for me to conceptualize and practice what might be thought of as a pedagogy of illiberal humanism, as a means of navigating a variety of conditions characterizing the contemporary US university toward minoritarian ends, and I'll be offering some thoughts along those lines in what follows. My remarks stray from the specific content of the book itself to pull in some thinking about from the writing I've been doing on teaching, as well as the longer research project on contemporary racialization. These are detours that I believe to be part of the bigger project of which the book is an expression, namely, whether and how the work we do as academics contributes to the short-circuiting of the sensibilities that uphold the rightness of liberal modernity, regardless of the violence required to do so, and enlivens and amplifies those organized around irrevocable relationality and uncontingent care. Less formally, I'm thinking of this event as occasion to talk together about how we may and do respond as teachers and scholars to the state of the world, to thinking collectively about the rationalization and normalization of violence by settler nations under the cloak of self-defense, about how the political prioritization of certain forms of violence, notably spectacular ones that appear temporally discrete, obscure recognition of the sometimes quieter but no less decimating longue durée forms of violence we call impoverishment or toxification, about the logics that authorize and regulate the differential distribution of life and death through such means as patent protections for pharmaceutical companies, and always about how and what we may learn and teach that help us to be in the world together, which is to say that rehearse and elaborate the forms of relationality we wish to proliferate. I believe attending to aesthetics and aesthetic education has something to contribute to our collective effort to address these conditions. That at least is what I'll suggest today. Toward those ends, I offer remarks organized into 3 sections, which will run about 25 minutes in total. So let's see. Section 1, in lieu of defense. For many of us whose intellectual genealogies are formatively rooted in ethnic studies or other minoritized and minoritarian traditions, but who find ourselves institutionally situated within such long-toothed traditional disciplines like English, the experience is regularly, perhaps even persistently, somewhere between odd and abrasive. This friction is, of course, a key source of our critical superpowers, which is to say, it fuels our collective ability to disidentify with and from institutional norms. It is from this situated vantage and in the company of other others that I took notice of the growing and increasingly fervent pleas for the defense of the humanities in the face of the crisis confronting them that proliferated in both popular and academic venues throughout the first decades of this century. We know that the changes regularly referred to as neoliberalization and corporatization played out in such phenomena as the growth of the reliance on contingent labor and corporate and philanthropic sponsorship in place of public funding. These changes were and are palpable in the everyday life of the Academy and in ways I expect are all too familiar to those present in today's conversation. Yet and still from this vantage, it was and remains impossible to mount hearty defense of the humanities in the received liberal form, in light of the manifold critiques of their crucial role in buttressing the racial capitalist colonial modernity that is the world historical dominant we inhabit. Critiques articulated through such intellectual formations and genealogies as cultural studies, ethnic studies, post-colonial and decolonial, and feminist and queer theory. Indeed, these genealogies and their corollary social and political movements may be remembered to have intentionally brought the humanities to crisis in the late 20th century, and with good reason. Scholars and activists of these eras insisted that universities are embedded in and bear responsibility to and for the social, which means becoming accountable for and to the relationship between institutional and curricular exclusions of the kind the liberal humanities excel in justifying, and the colonial, racialized, gendered, and class hierarchies characterizing US culture and politics. In brief, as I wrote in the book, while it is impossible to ignore the manifold adverse effects of the corporatization and intensifying privatization of the university on the humanities, neither is it possible to stand simply in defense of the disciplinary formations clustered under the rubric of the humanities, which have been and continue to be instrumental to the production and sustenance of social hierarchies and their subtending structures and material inequalities. Accordingly, I suggested that instead of defending the humanities, we are prompted to ask just what it is we are being called to defend. Moreover, we may ask the corollary question, what would a defensible humanities be and do? How, in other words, might we respond to Lisa Lowe's eloquent enunciation of the need to act within but think beyond our received humanist tradition, to visualize, mourn, and think other humanities within the received genealogy of the human? What Lowe is describing may be understood as a turn toward poesis, a turn from the diagnostic mode that has over the past long while helped us accumulate abundant evidence of racism and colonialism and cis-heteropatriarchy and so on, such that we are ever more sure of what we are against, and toward elaborating what we are for, that is, those other humanities. Sylvia Wynter, a principal guiding intellectual light in this project, provides the formulation that clarifies that the work of deriving what we are for involves creating a rupture with the present order of things. By taking these cues from Lowe and Wynter, among others, and by following the lead of artists and writers whose work is disidentified from the liberal order, that present order of discourse, we may enunciate a humanism and humanities emergent from the liberation of the human from liberalism's grasp. That's the governing proposition of the difference aesthetics makes. Such artists and writers, including Lan Samantha Chang, Alan D'Souza, Toni Morrison, Ruth Ozeki, Langston Hughes, Monique Trong, Leslie Marvin Silko, Sarah Zay, and Carrie Mae Weems, afford the elaboration of the humanisms that are provisionally referred to as illiberal, generated through disidentification from bourgeois liberalism and its cognate ways of being and knowing. Liberal humanisms bring forward an understanding of human beingness to be defined not by discrete and self-possessed individuality, but instead by constitutive relationality. They refuse bourgeois aspirations and illuminate their parochialism and meanness. and they are organized and oriented toward and by an ethics of uncontingent care. In the course of working on this project, I came to a distinct appreciation for the potency of aesthetics, and thus to an understanding of the potency of aesthetic education. Historically, as part of the Enlightenment project, the aesthetic has served as a powerful axis along which the kinds of persons idealized as the modern liberal subject capable of self-governance were distinguished from those conceived to be incapable of achieving such subjectivity. In brief, the incapacity for proper aesthetic judgment signaled the difference between those who would and would not realize human potential. This differential capacity contributed to rationalizing the dehumanization necessary to racial capitalism in its partnership with colonialism and settler colonialism. And it was in part recognition of this history by women of color feminists and aligned intellectuals that contributed to the turn away from aesthetics and toward cultural studies in the 70s and 80s. Aesthetics, we might remember, was in the latter decades of the 20th century met with considerable and wholly understandable suspicion as a result of this history and how it continued to play out in contemporary forms, namely through the subordination or exclusion of minoritized artists and writings. What those artists and their work robustly demonstrate, however, is that we cannot not attend to aesthetics. For it's through aesthetics that we come not only to understand, but to feel and believe viscerally, as if inevitably and by nature, what and whom to admire and fear, what and whom to desire and detest, and as well as what constitutes truth and who its rightful purveyors are, while others can never be. It is, in other words, the domain through which sensibility, which denotes both that which may be sensed and that which is judged reasonable, commonsensical, coordinates an intimate relationship between thinking and feeling. Accordingly, I understand aesthetics as referring to the relationships among the senses and processes and structures of value making by which certain sensibilities become common sense and others are disavowed, subjugated, or otherwise obscured. Aesthetics in this regard emphasize sensibility and the sensus communis as crucial domains of knowledge and politics. Paying attention to them as such affords recognition of not only the relations, structures, and practices of power that legitimate and naturalize certain ideas over others, but also the knowledge and ways of living variously affirmed or subordinated in the process. In short, I believe we cannot not attend to aesthetics, both because they've been a crucial component in the establishment, rationalization, and reiteration of racial capitalism, colonialism, and settler colonialism, by means of the production and regulation of common sensibility, and because ways of being and living radically alternative to the common sense of modernity are elaborated on the terrain of sensibility. Section 2, sensing proximities. In the academy, in ways that reflect the identitarian and representational politics of modernity, such common sense is in part produced through the arrangements of knowledges into seemingly discrete compartments. The structure has, as Jody Melamed and Roderick Ferguson's work has respectively shown, allowed for the absorption of the radical transformative agendas of Black and women's and ethnic studies through the management of difference. The proliferation of sociopolitical identity-based rubrics, women's literature, Asian American literature, African American history, and so on, bespeaks this administration of difference through formal incorporation. The field coverage model structuring disciplines like English readily expands by addition, administratively incorporating heretofore excluded subjects without requiring transformation of the structures of what had been, the structures already in place. According to this model, we are supposed to hew to our assigned lanes of critical inquiry through a logic that combines territoriality with an identitarian essentialism that expects and assumes correspondence between critic and object. Asian Americans ought to write about Asian Americans, gender and sexuality belong in the terrain of women's studies, Black theorists are expected to write about Blackness, the Latinx scholar on matters pertaining to brownness, and so on. Such assumptions and expectations operate on a fundamental misunderstanding, a produced and even willful ignorance as to the constitution of the kind of work unfolding under these administrative rubrics. Well, to be sure, there is such a rich heterogeneity across these intellectual formations that it's certainly possible to find work that rehearses such correspondence. It is also the case that as epistemological projects, these are fields that have pressed repeatedly on and against essentialism and structured procedures underlying and driving such assumed correspondence in the course of asking after how and why racial categories emerge and operate. Laura Kang has formulated this issue in terms of the non-correspondence between Asian women and women in Asia. My version of such is the reminder that there are no Asians in Asia, which is to say, Asia is meaningful as a name for a relationship to global geopolitics. It is an engineered geography metaphor and decidedly not an ontological referent. These are matters of aesthetics, of sensibility, insofar as the racial categories feel true, as if they are simply common sense designations that are neutrally descriptive rather than constitutive iterations. Stare at any of them for any length of time and their solidity melts away, which is not to say that they don't have immense material power. To this point, I'll note that I've been newly interested in the effects of the compartmentalized knowledge in the course of trying to apprehend contemporary Asian racialization. I have for some time now been trying to understand how Asianness functions as a racial category in US history, culture, and politics. In recent years, my interest has been freshly piqued by observing the designation of the 21st century as the Asian century and the changes to the global political economic landscape that that construct attempts to name, coupled with living through the unabashed and renewed legitimation of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment and action in and by the United States, especially since 9/11. What might the contemporary coincidence of the Asian century and anti-Arab racism tell us about the current conjuncture? Such a question leads to recognizing the mostly bifurcated ways in which Orientalism has been treated in US academic discourses, such that the Asian and the Arab do not regularly inhabit the same critical spaces. What might come of juxtaposing the discourse of the Asian century with a long history, as well as contemporary forms of US Orientalism, expressed both and variously as anti-Asian and anti-Arab racism? What aesthetics and analytics emerge by doing so? And how might they advance the de-Orientalization of knowledge and the power and effects accruing thereto? Drawing on Roy Perez's elaboration of a poetics of proximity, I'm proposing that we consider what might come not only of deliberately placing the Asian and the Arab in critical proximity, but also in acknowledging how the proximities have been occluded and why. In Perez's work, consideration of how Marvin Wong's Poetics of Proximity unfold a relationality between Chineseness and New Yorkerness that is one of both too much and too little, elucidates Latinidad's ambivalence toward queerness. The neglect of Wong's significance to the apprehension of Nuyorican Latinidad, Perez submits, indexes what he describes as the ethnic insularity and sexual normativity that forms the center of its gravity. Following Perez's emphasis on proximity, on how proximity provides for incompletion and unfinishedness as queer modes of thought and relation, as ones that simply ask what happens, what is made, and what we might make by letting people and figures and ideas sit alongside each other. I hope here to elicit lingering in the too much and too little that is the constructs of the Asian and Asian American, seen in the light and context of what we might think of as the Orientalized contemporary conjuncture. Consider, for example, what happens when we allow images of Buddhism and Islam circulating in US culture to keep each other company. Images of a smiling Dalai Lama coupled to those of a menacing Muhammad, or perhaps the figure of an individual Buddhist monk meditating in lotus position and groups of Muslim men kneeling in prayer, or of Muslim women wearing head coverings of various kinds. Media and religious studies critics have provided data on the pervasiveness of these representations of Buddhism and Islam. And we know, following the work of Jane Iwamura, Sharon Suh, Evelyn Al-Sultani, Ella Shohat, and others working on these matters, that these representations help to rationalize the differential and sharply inequitable distribution of life and life chances along the axis of race, always intersectionally understood. None of this, of course, is particularly surprising, both in the gross oversimplification of these religions through these typological representations and in the tidy alignment of the happy Asian against the threatening Arab with the dominant ideologies of US nationalism and imperialism. That we are aesthetically induced to distinguish the Asian from the Arab iterates the logic of Orientalism. This is readily recognizable as a version of the kind of dichotomization familiar to us as model minority discourse, whereby the putatively good people of color are contrasted against the bad ones. Here we have varieties of Orientals to serve in these roles. The image of the individual monk in meditative and peaceful solitude fits tidily with the privileged place of individualism in the dominant American psyche, and the ways that meditation and yoga as activities associated with Eastern spirituality have been recruited toward the wellness regimes necessary to be ever more productive members of society bespeak how the erasure of complexity, including of the strongly masculinist orientation of Buddhism, affords its embrace by the US public. For me, this representational difference between the Buddhist and the Muslim as metonyms for the Asian and the Arab is a representational difference that renders visible the recruitment of time in the buttressing of racial colonial modernity through Orientalism. That not all Asians are Buddhist or Arabs Muslim is rendered moot in this racializing procedure. Orientalism has never been about factuality. As I'll explain further in a moment, the conditions giving rise to the Asian century as a meaningful construct marks a specific exigency for refusing the segregation of the Asian and the Arab, precisely because it is a construct in part animated by the explicit casting of the Asian future against an Arab past, which provides the broad context within which we might understand the failure of the US state to intervene in the current assaults against Palestinians, as well as the surge of US cultural feeling renouncing what is rendered Asian hate, but which seems primarily to be directed at anti-Asian racism. Hovering here is the question: who may be attacked with impunity and who deserves protection? Emerging toward the end of the so-called American century, the 20th century, the Asian century is both descriptive and affectively charged. Debates about the veracity and usefulness of the construct suggest that such challenges as China's and India's massive populations and restrictively structured domestic social policies will complicate the sustenance of economic growth. For these reasons, some predict, the 21st century will be multipolar more so than controlled by any single country or region. Notably, these latter arguments are advanced by US political scientists and economists and register a reluctance to posit the end of US geopolitical and economic influence. And some express optimism that despite the shifting economic landscape, the United States will retain an advantage by dint of its relatively small and diverse and therefore flexible population, as well as its connectedness across the world. The specter and diagnosis of America's decline, in other words, percolates within the genealogy and conditions giving rise to the rubric, the Asian century. In part, the transition of the United States from creditor to debtor nation rationalizes the ascription of decline in this context. The nation that engineered the post-World War II infusion of funds into Europe and Asia was, by the start of this century, borrowing money at the rate of about $800 billion a year. In short, as an aerial economic descriptor, the construct of the Asian century has some explanatory power. At the same time, it serves as a kind of emotional signifier, to borrow Punching Chang's terms. Along these lines, we may acknowledge that the nomination of the Asian century indexes and gives form to the anxieties attending the waning of US geopolitical power, the anxieties attending the end of the American century. These are recognizably anxieties electoral politicians have, with varying degrees of success, recruited toward various ends, including in more contemporary times and in notable ways, President Obama and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. The explicit pivot to Asia made by the Obama administration in response to Asia's growing geopolitical economic power registers this connection and takes textual form in two revealing pieces. The first is a piece published in October of 2011 in Foreign Policy by Clinton titled America's Pacific Century. The title of the essay definitely evokes a geography that includes the United States, the Pacific rather than Asia, which has the benefit both of disallowing Asia's pride of ownership and simultaneously taking possession of this new century as America's. Clinton explains, as the war in Iraq winds down and America begins to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan, the United States stands as a pivot point. Over the last 10 years, we have allocated immense resources to these two theaters. In the next 10 years, we need to be smart and systematic about where we invest time and energy so that we put ourselves in the best position to sustain our leadership, secure our interests, and advance our values. She elaborates further. At a time when the region is building a more mature security and economic architecture to promote stability and prosperity, US commitment there is essential. It would help build that architecture and pay dividends for continued American leadership well into this century. Clinton's speech simultaneously acknowledges the importance of the Asia-Pacific in global geopolitics and reinstalls a developmental narrative according to which the region remains behind America. That is, a region still in the process of maturation and thus in need of US guidance. In the second textual example, in a speech to the Australian Parliament just 1 month later, President Obama reiterated this commitment to the Asia-Pacific. Our new focus on this region reflects a fundamental truth. The United States has been and always will be a Pacific nation. Asian immigrants helped build America, and millions of American families, including my own, cherish our ties to this region. From the bombing of Darwin to the liberation of Pacific Islands, from the rice paddies of Southeast Asia to a cold Korean peninsula, generations of Americans have served here and died here so democracies could take root, so economic miracles could lift hundreds of millions to prosperity. Americans have bled with you for this progress, and we will not allow it. We will never allow it to be reversed. Obama continued, here we see the future, deftly creating a geography that casts the Middle East as the past. Together, Clinton's and Obama's explanations of the necessity of a turn toward the Asia-Pacific acknowledge US foreign policy's preoccupation with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the first decades of the century, and rationalize America's importance to the Asia-Pacific in terms that equate US prosperity with that of the regions. Obama's explicit rendering of a genealogical connection to the Asia-Pacific, from his biography to the role of immigrants in US nation building to self-sacrificing service by US military personnel, conjures an obligatory relationship between the US and the Asia-Pacific, specifically one of indebtedness and the Asia-Pacific to the United States. Moreover, it is an indebtedness pervaded by a tacit but palpable threat. Obama later in this speech notes that, quote, the United States is a Pacific power and we are here to stay. Couched as reassurance that the United States will stand by and with Australia, a longtime ally, it is difficult not to notice the threatening overtones evoked by the repeated claims of potency and enduring presence. There is a certain pathos that attaches to the Obama administration's insistence on US global supremacy and its associated vision of the future, and one that was very much carried forward to the Trump administration's incoherent but nonetheless potent claims to American greatness regardless of empirical reality. Certainly, though the United States continues to be a formidable military presence on the global stage, China has largely usurped its function as a global economic driver. As China advances its Belt and Silk Road initiative, in part by entering into partnership with and investing in the Persian Gulf region, it does so by casting US primacy as outdated. In a clear comment on the policies and ethos of the Trump administration, a recent commentary by Xinhua, a Chinese state-run media agency, noted, as some Western countries move backwards by erecting walls, China is contriving to build bridges, both literal and metaphorical. Trump's naming of COVID the Chinese virus undoubtedly fanned the flames of anti-Asian sentiment, but he got to that racist utterance thanks not only to his immediate predecessors in the White House, but also because of the long-lived intimate connections among military might, political power, and wealth on the global scale that are the conditions of possibility for the Asian century's emergence. All this is to suggest that bringing the Asian and Arab into critical proximity helps us understand how the aestheticization of racial difference into common sense relies on holding them apart. Identitarian politics and frameworks are wholly inadequate to naming the sensibility of compresence. We may move the logics of correspondence and relevance embedded in such politics and paradigms to instead insist on their relationality. In that way, we may attune ourselves toward futures that do not require the relegation of others to the past. Section 3. Pedagogy of illiberal humanism. By way of closing, I ask you to move with me into Noor Hindi's poem, Fuck Your Lecture on Craft, My People Are Dying. to dwell among the flowers that at once aestheticized settler colonial occupation and marked the impossible mandate to comply with its aesthetics. The poem enjoins us to ask, what are we looking at when we focus on the flowers and the moon as the exemplars of beauty abstracted from worldly location? What aren't we seeing when we embrace flowers and the moon as a proper language of poetry? What if we define, as Hindi does here, beauty as the act of the refusal of colonial power by the most vulnerable, which is to say, beauty as a category bearing the whole history of life and violence unfolding today as it has for the past century? What if we embrace as an organizing principle for the humanities refusal of the terribly superficial liberal multicultural embrace that stands as a wish for happy Ramadan? Notice how the poem cannot settle into a single tense as it moves through a series of constative statements issued outside the institutional academic authority of the lecture on craft, as it crafts in the space not only of refusal, but of disidentified relationship to the denial of Palestinians a future. I promise to haunt you forever, and one day I'll write about the flowers like we own them. Against the scenes of the violence unfolding these recent weeks, Hindi's poem reminds us of not only the ongoingness of Palestinian death, of the forced removal of hundreds of thousands of people and destruction of hundreds and hundreds of villages, certainly since 1948, as well as the aesthetic education that gives us nature delinked from the world and obscures that reality. But also, crucially, she gives us the perdurance of Palestinian life. As Hindi has written in relation to the work of poet Dareen Tatour, her own work distills the history of 7 decades in which Palestinian resistance and sumud exist on a continuum that refuses complacency and consolation. Hindi's work prompts us in this way to unfold the distillation, to parse and illuminate and bring forward the long histories involving British Empire and American militarism and the consolidation of exclusionary nationalism as a seemingly inevitable world historical dominant that are part of the conditions giving rise to Palestinian death and resistance. The British historian Arnold Toynbee wrote in 1971 of what he referred to simply as, quote, the wrong that has been done to Palestinian Arabs, that the responsibility for the wrong done is widespread. Now nations and individuals alike must assume the imperative task of informing themselves of the nature of the conflict in the Middle East. 50 years later, it is startlingly clear that that task remains imperative. Let us keep proximate, keep company with the aesthetics that insist on the worldliness of ideas about beauty, that locate the stakes of aesthetics in terms of the common sense that renders life and lives disposable, and in that way make sensible the responsibility of the critic, the humanist, to subjugate its sensibilities and knowledges and histories. To close, I circle briefly back to where I began, by asking how we may and do respond as teachers and scholars to the state of the world, to thinking collectively about the rationalization and normalization of violence by settler nations under the cloak of self-defense, about the political prioritization of certain forms of violence and how that obscures recognition of the sometimes quieter but no less decimating longue durée forms of violence, about the logics that authorize and regulate the differential distribution of life and death, and always about how and what we may learn and teach that help us to be in the world together, which is to say that rehearse and elaborate the forms of relationality we wish to proliferate. Thank you. You're muted, Laura.
Thank you for this really wide-ranging and really moving presentation. And Anjali has a question. So I was going to ask questions, but I'll ask mine later. But I want to also ask people in the audience to please put questions in the queue and let me know. And so Anjali, I'm going to make you answer. Oh, you would like to answer this. So Juhun, I don't know if you can help me. How do we get Anjali to answer the question?
I can do it. One
Great,
moment.
thank you.
Hi, Anjali.
Angela, you can ask a question now.
I think you have to unmute
Unmute
yourself.
yourself, Anjali, and let's see.
Angela, you can also type your question.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Candice, if you were here, I would show you your book, which is wonderfully tagged and I've learned so much from. But unfortunately, I can't do that. So I'll have to do my fangirling at some other point. I want to thank both you and Laura for your amazing books, which have certainly helped me a lot. So I have a one comment and one very short question. My comment is that it's really interesting to note that the terminology Asia Pacific is no longer being used. Indo-Pacific is the one that's being used more by US, Australia, New Zealand. And that has to do with the hegemony of India within all of this, in addition to the Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean. So that's just something, I would love to hear more about what you make of that, or if it's relevant at all. But my question is more about, which emanated from the reading of your book and also the wonderful meditation you shared today. I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about conceptual forms and epistemes like secularism, which persist between the kind of wonderful movement you're making from the liberal to the illiberal. So in many ways, I'm persuaded by the moves you're making between the Arab and the Asian, but there is something about the kind of evacuation of religious education as aesthetics in the kind of mobilization of secularism that sort of sustains, even as we entangle and move out of that old mode of the human. So any thoughts you may have on that would be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here, Anjali, and for the question and kind engagement. So a couple of different things. One is about the Indo-Pacific. Yeah, I think all of these terms, they're shifting so quickly. And I have to say, I'm also curious as to what happens on the other side of COVID. And I'm saying the other side of COVID, even though I'm not sure that there is going to be another side, but the different ways in which the pandemic has played out and is playing out in our various sites that I think is producing a kind of global geography where Asia, various places in Asia, and particularly India and China, are there's such a focus and such a kind of thematization of what's happening in those particular sites right now. So I don't know how that's going to play out for me in terms of my thinking, but certainly part of the problem or part of the difficulty I've had in relation to all of this, kind of apprehending what the Asian century might mean, is that the terms are really shifting so quickly, and in part because we're just starting the century. So I'm not, it's a long way of saying I don't know. I don't really know what the Indo-Pacific will mean, but I do think that even tracing the changes will be really fascinating. I think the other thing, so in terms of secularism, yeah, it's actually, I feel that as really kind of a strong missing piece, it's like the haunting presence for me. And I'm really informed largely by Talal Assad's work, thinking through secularisms, not as the absence of religion, but as the presencing of a different form of belief system and ideologies around that, and the humanisms and the kinds of devastating and destructive humanisms that accompany that. So that's one thing. The second thing is, and this is, in some version of this project, there was more of a conversation about the transition from an understanding of human ontology as religious, fundamentally religious, to the kind of secular mode that we are more familiar with in relation to or associate with the emergence of modernity, and the kind of, marking a shift in conception, but not marking a an erasure or an absence or a loss of the potency of religiousness that continues forward. So in other words, I do think that certainly in terms of philosophical discourse, we shift the ontological kind of explanation for human beingness from God, right, to ourselves. But in doing so, I think we bring forward certain ideas, but couch them in different terms. So the ecstatic becomes the aesthetic in some ways, right? The epiphanic, the kind of aesthetic encounter, the moment of surprise and the moment of newness is something that we see also in religious discourses. So there is tracing, and I think that there are genealogies that could be brought forward that way. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there's some part of this Asian Studies project that it really began just by noticing the representations of Buddhism and Islam. And it was really just, kind of paying attention to what was kind of circulating in media. That started me thinking about religiousness, right? Not just as representation, but actually about the kind of content of the religions. And I just haven't had a chance to do more with it. So it's certainly, I think we have to go there in many ways.
Next, we actually have a question from Lisa Lowe. And thank you for being here, Lisa. I mean, you're so important to both of us. It's an honor to have you here. Please ask your question.
One moment.
You want me to ask it?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, both for having Kandice for the presentation and the wonderful book. And my question is about, as you might anticipate, how the pandemic and also the calls for abolition and racial justice may have changed how we can make the critique of the liberal humanities, and whether or not, maybe another way of asking it would be, how does the pandemic and the different political moment change the kinds of questions we can ask, and whether or not, how you feel about the responses that we've had so far. So in a way, it seems like we've seen a lot of, for example, departments wanting to add African Americanists or Asian Americanists. So there's been a kind of reckoning, but in a very identitarian way. And then on the other hand, a kind of nostalgia for, the liberal humanities that came before, and a kind of fictionalizing of its plenitude.
Right.
I just wonder if you've seen that as well, and how it's affected how you might respond and make the critique.
Right. Thank you, Lisa. I have a couple of different things. So starting with thinking about how, what the conditions of pandemic have brought to bear. A couple of different responses. One is, I think it's become so startlingly and unmistakably apparent that only institutional cover, is necessary for any kind of life to unfold. In the US context at least, and here I have to talk about it specifically here. So people who don't have the coverage of an employer or a school or some kind of institutional formation, maybe the military even, are quite literally left in the streets and without any kinds of resources. So even COVID, I think, has been hard for people who do have resources. So those who are already precarious, I think, have been really abandoned in this way. And I think that that's part of what we're seeing. Certainly in New York City, that's what we're seeing. Really visibly on the streets, I think that's what's playing out. So I think that in that way, one of the things that I, as executive officer, one of the ways that I think about my job, that's our version of chair, we don't have chairs at the Grad Center, is that I think of my job as trying to hold open space for as many people as possible. So that a really, really basic, functional, pragmatic way, nobody gets kicked out, nobody has to leave, and you try to bring in as many bodies as you can. it's not because I think institutionality is the solution. It's that that's what's available to me right now. So that's a little of how I see that, see our jobs. So in that respect, anything that we can do to mobilize and leverage whatever institutional resources we have to create openings for people, I think is really key. I would say that it seems to me like a lot of the trends, maybe this isn't true actually, I feel like I see a lot of hiring of senior scholars. And I really want to make the argument, or to strongly encourage those of us who have the opportunity to create jobs for junior people who don't have landings yet, who are just finishing their degrees and need a spot somewhere, rather than moving the same 12 people around the planet. I also think that, one of the things I realized during pandemic, and partly I'd been working on this collection of essays on teaching, but it was also actually moving into pandemic mode and thinking not only about my own teaching, but about what we were doing as a program. And I just thought, what is the thing that we want to do right now? Is it actually to make people have to write a rigorous 12-page paper? Or is it that we can practice forms of checking in, having conversations, being together, whatever that is, under the rubric of the class. And it isn't, I think reading is necessary work, right? I think intellectual work is necessary work to getting through and surviving. But I also think that it changed the ways that I think about how I make text selections, for example, what I bring into the classroom, right? If it can't help me have that conversation about forms of relationality, or forms of care that aren't about personality or aren't about meritocracy, I'm not as interested or invested in those anymore. So in those ways, I think that there are specific changes. I think in a broad way, the calls for abolition, calls for social justice and racial justice, I think, right, it seems to me that part of the amazing shift that has happened is a stronger awareness now that particularly abolition is not a call for the erasure of everything, but for the presencing of a different kind of world, of a different world itself, not a different kind of world. And that feels to me of a piece with what your work has been trying to do, what Laura's work certainly does, which is to get us not to stop at the moment of diagnosis, but actually to see what else there is, what else is possible. So yes, I think that this past year and the conditions that we are currently living, they're definitely changing what we are doing. I don't know if they are changing the questions we can ask, I guess. I don't know. What do you think? Can I throw that back at you, Lisa?
Thank you so much for your always thoughtful response. Well, I do think that we're seeing a deeper and more exacerbated version of the crises that already existed. So in a certain way, it becomes much clearer, when we want to teach the kind of, colonial divisions of humanity. Students don't have a hard time seeing those since they're laid bare all around us. So I do think that the legibility of the critique is different because of the social conditions.
Yeah.
But I really, really agree with what you're saying, Kandice, about this calling into question our pedagogy, and particularly, presumptions of meritocracy, grading, what work is. I think moving towards more collaborative work, different genres of work is all called for. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have a question from Jenny Terry. So Juhun, can you help with that?
From who? Jenny?
Jenny Terry, Jennifer Terry.
Jennifer, 1 moment.
She's-
Yep. Please unmute yourself, Jenny.
Thanks very much.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi, everybody. This is so wonderful to be part of this discussion. My question is really sort of spurred by the experience of teaching your book last year, Kandice, in a lovely relationality move in which Laura Kong designed a beautiful graduate seminar, was unable to teach it, generously handed the syllabus to me, and I got to teach the class. So anyway, that's the context, and it's very much driven by the conditions of the pandemic that all that happened.
Mhm.
The question was raised by a student, and I've been wondering what you think of this, and maybe it's just an easy enough question to field, but it concerns the use of the term illiberal. And I so appreciate what you're doing with that term in the book. But it's like so many, it's sort of like how transnational suddenly in the authoritative language of the State Department was a signifier for illicit drug trade and trafficking. In what ways do you have to contend with the use of that word in your own context and how it is used in sort of diplomatic discussions of the Samantha Power type, sort of and the ways in which illiberal within those settings of US empire diplomacy is, sees illiberal as a catchphrase for authoritarian and therefore bad. So can you talk a little bit about, it's a problem we all have to deal with in one way or another in our work, which is the contaminants of connotation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny. I mean, and for teaching, and Laura for incorporating it into your class. I'm so ambivalent about this term. I can't, whoever your student was really is like poking on the sore spot there. And I wish I had kept the slash. I wish I had kept the solidus, and I ended up editing it out. I don't know why I ended up editing it out. I mean, I think it felt too kind of postmodern diacritical or something in some moments, and I felt like I should just claim the term, but I'm really ambivalent about it. And the other move that in some version of the manuscript, I said something to the effect quite explicitly that the point here is not to claim the term illiberal. The point is actually to allow that to do other kinds of work, but not to sort of usher in, liberal humanist studies, that's really antithetical to what I hope will happen. So yes, I think that it is just a problem. I mean, and I don't mind it being an unsettled one. I don't mind it being a source of critique because I think it gets us to someplace, right? To actually have to sit inside of why that term doesn't work that well, because of these contexts, as you're suggesting, Jenny. There's a way that it's not just that it's overdetermined, but that it seems like it is the opposite to liberal, and I don't mean it that way. Opposite to in the sense of the thing that is the enemy to the U.S. nation state, for example, right? And I don't really think in terms of enemies, right? I mean, I think that the illiberal is actually a way, for me at least, it contains liberalism, right? It actually is the bigger rubric. It's the way in which we can always remember the parochialism of liberalism, despite how much and how intensely and with what huge effects it has been given to us as the universal. But yeah, I mean, it's an unsatisfying answer, Jenny. I mean, I think, I will just fall back to saying, I think that your student is right. I don't think that it's a term without flaws or without problems. It's the provisionality of it for me is that I wanted to try to not use anti or de or post, right? Like not to actually be really to try to emphasize that there was a kind of a presencing, to really to put some kind of positive weight toward what I understood or what I experienced to be the ideas that were coming forth through these writings and these artists' work. And I don't know that I did it, but that's where I landed with that.
Can I just add to the discussion about the illiberal, the kind of the risks of the illiberal, which is maybe one way that we can kind of think beyond the liberal illiberal shuttling back and forth, which is what you say in your introduction, where you said we need to activate ways of going beyond the sometimes strenuous demands of disciplinarity and professionalization. And this is where you say ways that are not so much interdisciplinary, but are instead deliberately promiscuous, because illiberal seems like it's it's a forbidding, right? And then for me, the idea of being also, because there's a risk also with promiscuous as well, but so we need the deliberately in there before the promiscuous. And so is that a way that we can kind of rethink the problem of the missing solidus in the illiberal, in terms of thinking it about a kind of deliberate promiscuity?
As a practice, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yes, as a practice. And one of the things I like about the term promiscuous is that it is about opening yourself to feeling a sense of desire, right? It's about desiring for and allowing those kinds of undisciplined desires, right, to come forward. So sure, I mean, I guess, I don't also want to say that interdisciplinarity is not important, right? I mean, I think that it's key, but I think it's because interdisciplinary has gotten made into such a, I don't know, a marketing term, right, for universities, that's what I was trying to get away from a little bit. There's a moment in Catherine McKittrick's Dear Science, the book that she has out. It's a footnote, actually. She talks about how Black studies scholars are undisciplined in a very specific way, right? That it's undisciplined in a very, very specific and kind of meaningful and rigorous way. That's the sensibility that I wish to bring forward, that it isn't like that promiscuity is really super intense, right? I mean, that there's something that's really, it's hard work, to actually have to go into places where you don't know anything about stuff, where you're actually just led because out of curiosity. I mean, where you end up and, where you did in archives that are reading about, people who knew that they existed on the planet, that sort of stuff. I mean, I think that there is something about allowing yourself to be seduced. That was language that was actually in some version of the manuscript, because I do think of the book as offering propositions, right? I mean, I don't want to argue, I don't, and so just wanted to say, what do you think, and the word proposition or that mode is also a little bit seductive. Like, here, I have a proposition for you. What do you think? But that has its own dangers, right? Just like promiscuity in some ways, or kind of in a different way, promiscuity. But I think that is ultimately, that's a part of it, right? It's like allowing ourselves to feel that sense of excitement, and that is about a new encounter with something that makes your skin tingle in some way. And I think ideas can do that as much as anything else. And this is me just kind of, that's an old-fashioned way of thinking about the encounter with something that we call art, right? Where you go, oh, that's cool, that's all I want, really. It's a little bit of an addiction that way. But I think that in itself, within the context of so much disciplinarity, I mean, this goes back to the conversation with Lisa in some ways, the context of so much credentializing and look at the language that we use, right? How are we training our students? It's like, I don't know. I don't know that I want to train so much as just offer propositions, actually, as it were.
Yes, but we also, I think circling back to Lisa's, really insightful question, which is, I think that the terrible conditions of the present moment has also in some ways created a kind of, a nostalgia for a fiction of interdisciplinarity as a version of plenitude. And I think your book is one that the illiberal is also a kind of caution of, that interdisciplinarity is not like we get to do everything we want and pick and choose. That it's that kind of completely in some ways, volitional and self-making way of thinking about non-disciplinary intellectual work. Right?
And this is something that I've been trying to write through, and this is, conversations I've had with other people as well. I'm trying to think about and write through a difference that I feel between messiness, which I actually quite like sometimes as an indication of the genuine curiosity, and sloppiness, which sometimes it comes across in some writing, and I go, I don't, and I worry about it in my own, but I think there's something qualitatively different there, and I don't know I haven't yet figured out how to frame it so that it isn't a reiteration of, here are the proper credentializing rigorous methods that you must learn. And so that there's room for that, but also to say, but there's work also, right? Like there's actual time and effort and labor and thinking and unmaking of yourself. Genuine learning, right, is a total disassembly of yourself and then kind of a remaking. And that there's just some of the work that I don't want to throw shade on anything. I just, I'm kind of like, I don't know what to do with this, because it strikes me as somehow different than curiosity unfolding. It's like lack of work or something. I don't know. I sound like I'm really attached to work.
Well, I think this was a good place to switch gears to a question actually from, not just a critical theorist, but a practicing artist. So Simon Leung, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, great. So yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It's really very thought-provoking. So I'm really just thinking about the idea of art and aesthetics, not simply as an academic, or maybe an interpretive type of object, but that how aesthetics is really, Alex Jones has an aesthetic, or Fox News has an aesthetic just as much as Alan D'Souza has an aesthetic, right? So in a way, I'm thinking about the instrumentalization of the aesthetic, both in the American right, but of course the right, all over the world, but also how art as a category can be thought of as a sort of alibi for civil society, for example. So I think about this in relationship to how contemporary art in China for the last 20 years or so has existed as a type of neoliberal, but also just simply a placeholder for civil society without actually having civil society. Of course, that's cracking down now, and you can't do many things that you were able to do just 5 years ago in Hong Kong and China. So I just want to hear you talk a little bit more about how power uses the aesthetic.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you for being here. Two responses. One is, I think there is a way that when you think about, as I do, understand the aesthetic as a way of thinking the political, right? So aesthetics as, and this is following Jacques Rancière, understanding who and what are legible and sensible and can register within a given political economic regime, a symbolic economy, as somebody to listen to, as somebody who has a voice. That is fundamentally aesthetic, which is to say, it's about sensibility. It's about how we understand what who gets to be heard as reasonable, what demands get to be heard as reasonable and not. So I wouldn't necessarily think of power as something separate from the aesthetic. I do think that there are lots of ways that aesthetics mobilize toward or recruited toward certain political ends. So the flag, right, is a key example of that. And I'm talking about flags as, for example, in a lot of the protest marches, right, in the US context, there's been a lot of American flag waving, right, to kind of reconsolidate the Americanness and the belongingness of X group. And recently it's been of the Asian in the US. And that is a kind of aesthetics, right? There is an aesthetics and a design to the flag that is always toward the ends of the conservation of the systems of power that are already in place. But I think there is also always, right, so that's one thing about the aesthetic, but I do think that there's always aesthetics happening everywhere, right? So there is the activity of art making, which I understand to be something like the activity of making life, which is, just an expression of vitality, an expression of livingness, right? I think that that's happening all the time, everywhere. And that the academic question of what we are paying attention to is quite a different thing than the actual activity that's happening and unfolding. We're, as academics, or at least I always feel that I am belated, right? That I'm always coming back into something after the fact. And for me, my relationship to the materials that I think with, right, the art objects or the writings, those are things that they select me. Like, it's not that I have a set of questions and then I go out and find texts that are going to, help me answer them. It's rather the things that I couldn't shake off, the things that just sort of stuck with me, that I, in a literal sense, was trying to make sense of and with. And those are the things that would fall under the rubric of art for me. So it doesn't necessarily have to be those things that we see in the academic realms, right? Stories or, artworks or whatnot. But I am interested in, as a teacher and as a humanist teacher, right, somebody who works under that rubric, what is it that I can bring in through the institutional authority, right, through the routes that are available to me, that can amplify something that we haven't seen, that wouldn't necessarily serve those in authority, those who are vested in with power. So, those are kind of my, I guess that's where I would say I land on those questions. I think that it's enormously important to leave open room for the expressive activities, the life-making activities that we don't name a thing, that some of them actually shouldn't ever come to light in some ways, that they aren't meant to be the fodder for writing. I don't know. The situation that's unfolding in Hong Kong and China, I mean, there are people who are inside and kind of on the ground who I think, when I'm thinking about something like, what is possible, what the foreclosures are, and why certain forms of the imagination, right, the imagination as to what civic society might look like, the questions are so pressing and so compelling, and it's not, I would never go and say, well, and therefore you should not have a civil society, because in civil society in the US context means that it's a suppression of X, Y, and Z, but rather to say, what are the other forms and practices of governance or ways of being that you would want to bring forward that rubric of civil society doesn't allow for, that rubric of even as the authoritarian regime also doesn't allow for it, right? And those are impossibly difficult questions to ask and answer.
So I want to practice my due diligence and ask, read a question out loud from Joe John. And then, I think you've partly actually addressed it in just what you said, but see if, you can add a little in once you hear the question. So Joe asks, first of all, he says, thank you for this wonderful talk. I wonder if you could speak a little more about how you are thinking about aesthetics. I take the point about aesthetic judgments becoming part of a communal sense, but we know that Kantian judgments and the categories that they form, the beautiful, the sublime, have been historically associated with a universalized Western subject that forms the basis of the liberal humanism that you are trying to move away from. So I guess I am wondering what an illiberal aesthetics might look like that simply does not lapse into earlier models?
Mm.
And what are the terms in which contemporary aesthetics emerges? Thinking here, for example, of Sian Nai's work. Thank you for an engaging talk.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you for the question and for being here, Joe. So yes, there is no, Kantian aesthetics have been universalized in ways that are absolutely detrimental to the majority of the planet. So my aim was not to try to reactivate that thread, but actually, in the same way that I think the version of humanism that operates is a very specific version of humanism, and this is Sylvia Wynter's work, right? I don't think that there's any reason we need to give up. We need to cede the territory of all of the things that aesthetics provides for us. So that language of aesthetics, because it allows us to refer to sense making, that is both about bodily sensation and about cognitive understanding, that for me feels really important, and a distinction from Kant, who really wants us to not have bodies, right? To pretend like we don't have them. I mean, it's kind of fun to read Kant right now because there's a lot of like this incredible effort to try to suppress body. You know, there's a lot of affect that's going on in his work. And then when you let it in, right? When you come from the place of like, oh, well, I can never be that subject that he wanted me to be. Let me be this other thing. I think that that's, you know, the way that I get to that is through Langston Hughes and Monique Trong and Len Samantha Chang. I mean, it isn't, those are for me iterations of what I refer to as illiberal aesthetics, which is to say, they are both super cognizant of that history, right? Not necessarily explicitly, but that structure, that regime that produces racial formations as that produces racialized bodies as lesser somehow, right? And mock it in some basic way, right? Not necessarily in a kind of ironic way, but are in that space of disidentification, in that space where, you know, there is full knowledge that we can't just opt out of those systems, but there's absolutely also full knowledge that we are not really incorporated by them, right? That they are inadequate to exhausting the fullness of being and the vitality that, you know, still perdures and persists. I mean, I think that this poem of Hindi Noor's that I ended with is really an ideal exemplar of that connection between different iterations of beauty and how that has to do with not only the worlds that we want to throw out, right? The world making that we want to do, but the already existing worlds that we can bring to bear, right? So I don't know. So I guess that's what I would say. It's like it's really remembering that people have, ever since there has been foreclosure and oppression, there has also been life that persists and perdures. And that seems like part of our job right now is actually to bring those to bear, right? In a really pragmatic sense, I think part of what I'm responding to is that, you know, we have argued for decades and decades about all the violences, about all the destruction that we live in, that most of the planet lives in. And it hasn't changed the political will. We're still doing it, right? So there's I don't want to not keep doing that, but I also want to say, unless we produce the alternatives, the things that we want to that we want to say, this is the world that you could exist in, right? The sort of desires and the, you know, possibilities and erotics and whatever else, right, that you want to throw out there. I don't know. I think we're going to lose that game, right? Unless we say, this is what we're for. You know, come play with us. It's so much better, so much better. So
I think that's the perfect note to end this event. Thank you for coming to think with us, to play with us. Let's keep thinking together, playing together, caring for each other. Thank you, Kandice, for this amazing gift to the world and the gift of yourself. Thank you all for joining us, and take care, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Laura, and everyone for coming. It was really lovely of you.